Well, hello. Today is June the 23rd, Wednesday, June the 23rd, and our Bible reading today comes from the book of 1 Corinthians. We're reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 today, although this particular message that I have is really going to be about the book of 1 Corinthians as a whole and where it fits within the time frame of Paul's travels in the book of Acts. Most of the videos that I've been doing as we've been going through our Bible reading together have been videos that say something about the chronology and the timing of Paul's letters and his travels. And the reason that I'm spending so much time on that is because, well, number one, I think it's fascinating, and I think it's just really interesting to see what Paul is doing, that he is traveling from town to town and preaching to various groups of people, but at the same time, he is often writing letters to people. And he is sending these letters, continuing to teach both churches and individuals, and he is having a great influence as he is traveling the world. So it's just really interesting is one thing, but the main reason that I'm spending so much time on this in these videos is because it helps us understand how the New Testament fits together. We often say about the Bible that it is a collection of 66 books, and it is just one story that is the overarching story of all of those books put together. And that's right. Every book has a place where it fits, and it has a purpose. When it was written for a purpose to a group of people, and all of this is one big picture, one big story, and it helps if we can kind of break it down and see where things fit together. So we're going to do that a little bit as we think about the Corinthian correspondence, as we think about the Apostle Paul and this church in the city of Corinth. Now, Paul comes to Corinth in Acts chapter 18. In Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, on the second missionary journey, Paul leaves Athens and he comes to the city of Corinth. And we talked some about that in our last video, about how when Paul left Berea, he separated from Silas and Timothy. He went down to Athens. They came down later, and then from there they split up again. And Silas and Timothy went up to Macedonia and checked on the churches in Thessalonica and presumably Philippi. Then they reconnect with Paul in the city of Corinth in Acts chapter 18 and verse 5. And Paul stays in the city of Corinth. Acts 18 and verse 11 says, for a year and 6 months. And so there's a lot of things that Paul does while in the city of Corinth, teaching and preaching, of course, but among them, he writes the 2 Thessalonian letters. You'll remember that from an earlier video. Now, I want to call your attention to something in Acts chapter 18. In Acts 18, Paul ends the second missionary journey. And when Luke brings the second journey to a close, he immediately starts into Paul's third journey. So look with me at Acts chapter 18 and verse 22. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. And having spent some time there, verse 23, he left and passed successively through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. You can easily miss it, but Acts 18 and verse 22 is the end of the second journey, and verse 23 is the beginning of the third journey. Luke just jumps right into it. And if you're speed reading the book of Acts, you'll miss this. So the second journey ends in chapter 18 and verse 22. And in chapter 18 and verse 23, the third missionary journey begins. So Paul begins the third journey from the city of Antioch in Syria. Once again, all 3 journeys began there. And in Acts chapter 19 and in verse 1, we read about Apollos being at the city of Corinth, and Paul passes through the upper country and comes to Ephesus. Now, Apollos has been in Ephesus, and Paul is going to encounter some people who apparently were taught by Apollos about the baptism of John, and we've read about that in Acts chapter 19, which we read last week. Incidentally, I didn't do any videos last week because I was at summer camp all week long, and I didn't have the time to do any videos from up there, but even if I did, I didn't have the cell service to upload them to the internet. So that's why there were no videos last week. Now, Paul spends a good deal of time in the city of Ephesus here in Acts chapter 19. We know from verse 10 of chapter 19 that Paul spent at least 2 years there in the city. And when we come to Acts chapter 20, he's going to talk about how for 3 years he stayed with the church in Ephesus and worked with them. So Paul spends a lot of time here. This is a long stop for him. But in Acts chapter 19, we see where the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians fit into the picture. In Acts chapter 19, look at verse 21. After these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now, verse 22 does not give us a specific amount of time that Paul stayed in Asia or Ephesus, which is a major city in the region of Asia. But while Paul is in that city, in Ephesus, he writes the Corinthian letter. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Paul mentions at the end of this letter that he is in the city of Ephesus when he writes this. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, notice in verse 8 of chapter 16, he says, "But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door for effective service has opened to me, and there are many adversaries." There is a wide door opened to me in Ephesus, and I'm going to stay here at least until Pentecost and pursue these opportunities that are available to me here. So Paul is writing the first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. And if you're taking into account the dates, the years, we're probably in AD 55 here or so. AD 55 is probably when Paul writes this. Now, I'd like to have some things to say more about the Corinthian correspondence, probably in another video, because there were apparently more letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians than we have at hand. We have 2, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but there were apparently other letters that Paul had written to them. There were letters that they wrote to Paul. And so maybe in another video I'll develop that a little bit more. But for now, I just wanted to call your attention to the timing, Paul's travels, where he is when he writes this letter, and presumably the second letter, or what we know as 2 Corinthians, as well from the city of Ephesus. So hopefully that's helpful to give you some context and some background on these letters. And again, I hope to have another video soon about all of the Corinthian correspondence, Paul's to the church and the church to the Apostle Paul. Thanks for reading with me today. God bless you.